Some people live most of their lives without ever once hearing three simple words, I choose you. She was a woman in her 50s, carrying the heavy weight of rejection. They called her too fat unwanted, and finally they sold her off like something with little value. Every step she took felt like another knife cutting deeper into her dignity until she almost believed her only purpose was to endure. But what she didn't know was, at the end of that long road, a pair of eyes was waiting, looking at her differently. Not as an object, not as a burden, but as a human being worthy of love. On a dusty western afternoon, when laughter and mockery filled the air around the auction, a tall cowboy stepped forward. He didn't bargain. He didn't argue. He just said one sentence that silenced the crowd. She's the first woman I ever chose, and I won't let anyone put a price on her again. Those words struck like a hammer, breaking down the walls she had built to survive. They awakened a hope she thought had been buried forever. Yet along with hope came fear. Could she really trust a heart when hers had been shattered so many times? Was this truly love or just pity disguised as kindness? That is the spark in the tragedy of this story, a woman who must relearn how to trust, and a man brave enough to stand against the world for what he believes is precious. This hook doesn't just open a late-blooming love story in the harsh West. It whispers to all of us, even after a lifetime of scars. Love can still come, still heal, and still be strong enough to make us believe again. Do you want to know what happens when a heart once sold cheap is cherished like treasure? The sun had only just risen, but the desert was already awake. Heat shimmered over the dry plains, carrying the cries of crows and the creak of wagon wheels. In the middle of the small town of Red Creek, a crowd gathered at the trading post, their eyes restless, voices hushed but cruel. On the makeshift wooden stage stood Martha, a woman of 50 years. She was broad-shouldered, round in body, her dress faded from too many washings, her hands calloused from years of labor. She wasn't what most in that town would call a prize. To them she was heavy, worn down, and too old for new beginnings. Her father, an aging drunk who had long seen her as a burden, rather than a daughter, stood nearby with narrowed eyes. His voice rang sharp. "Who will take her? She eats too much, works too slow, and I can't keep her no more." The crowd chuckled, some shaking their heads. Others offered coins like they were bidding on cattle. But when no one raised the price, he snarled, "Then she goes for what she's worth, 2 hogs and a bag of feed." And so it was. Just like that, Martha was traded, her dignity carved into pieces before people who never knew her story. Inside, she wanted to scream, to tell them she had spent years caring for her sick mother, nursing children that weren't hers, cooking, sewing, tending. She wanted to say that her body, this body they mocked, was strong enough to split wood, to haul water, to cradle the weak. But she said nothing. She stood silent, her chin lifted, eyes on the horizon. She had long since learned that words could be twisted, that women like her were rarely heard. Silence at least was hers to keep. The man who took her was no suitor, just another tradesman who needed labor. "You'll cook, you'll clean, you'll keep out of sight," he said gruffly. And so she was led away, not as a daughter, not as a bride, but as a commodity. Days blurred into weeks. Martha rose before dawn, kneading bread, fetching water, mending shirts that were never hers. At night she curled onto a thin cot in the corner of the kitchen, listening to the coyotes sing their lonesome song outside. She bore it with quiet strength, the same strength she had carried since childhood, the weight of others' needs pressing down her own longings buried beneath. She had wanted once to be loved, to be chosen, not tolerated. But life had taught her that some women were meant only to serve, not to be cherished. Still, something inside her refused to die. A flicker, faint but steady, like the lamp she lit every night on the windowsill. She told herself it was only habit, but deep down it was hope. One evening, as she kneaded dough, she heard a heavy knock at the back door. When she opened it, the setting sun framed a tall figure on horseback. A cowboy, broad as the horizon itself, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. "I was passing through," he said, his voice low and steady. He glanced at the small plain loaf cooling on the sill. "You selling bread?" She blinked, unused to kindness in a stranger's tone. "It's just scraps," she muttered, brushing flour from her hands. He smiled faintly. "Scraps'll do." He reached into his pocket, laid down coins more than the bread was worth. That night as he rode away, she sat at the window and held the coins in her palm. not for their value, but for what they meant. Someone had seen her, if only for a moment. And though she told herself not to think of it, she couldn't help but wonder, would he come again? The silence of her life had begun to crack. And in those cracks, the light of something new seeped through, faint, almost invisible, but alive. In the desert where she had been sold as worthless, a stranger's simple gesture stirred something she thought she'd lost. Could this fleeting kindness be the seed of a story she had long buried? The days in Martha's life followed a rhythm as predictable as the sunrise. She baked, swept, fetched water, and endured the sharp commands of the man who had traded hogs for her existence. Yet in her quiet heart, the memory of that cowboy lingered like a hymn she could not forget. It had been a single visit, coins laid on the table, a smile tucked beneath the brim of his hat. But for Martha, it was enough to disturb the silence she had worn like armor. A week passed, then another, and on the seventh evening, as the sky bruised into twilight, there was another knock at the back door. When she opened it, her breath caught. There he stood again, the same tall figure, the same quiet steadiness in his eyes. Dust clung to his boots and his horse shifted restlessly behind him. "Do you have more bread?" he asked. Her hands trembled, but she hid them in her apron. "Yes, it's nothing special." He shook his head slowly. "It's enough." This time he bought 2 loaves and left without another word. The visits became a pattern. Once a week, always near sundown. He never bargained, never asked questions, never lingered long. He would hand her coins, she would hand him bread. And yet each time she felt the weight of something unspoken stretching between them, like 2 notes of a song waiting for the melody to catch. At night she lay awake wondering who he was, why he came only for bread when there were other bakers in town, why his eyes softened just slightly when they met hers. The household mocked her behind her back. "The fat one thinks she's got an admirer," they sneered. But she didn't answer. She learned not to defend herself to people who only saw shadows. On the 4th week, the cowboy stayed longer than usual. He held the loaf in his hand but didn't mount his horse right away. "My name's James," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse. The sound of it startled her. It had been years since a man introduced himself to her as though she mattered enough to know his name. "I'm Martha," she replied, her voice quiet, almost shy. He nodded once. "Good bread, Martha. Worth more than you charge." For the first time in many years, heat rushed to her cheeks, not from shame, but from something gentler. The following week, she gathered the courage to ask, "Why do you keep coming here?" "There are bakers better than me." James met her gaze with an honesty she wasn't used to. "Because it tastes like someone cared when they made it." The words pierced her heart. Care. She had poured it into every loaf, every meal, every stitch of clothing she'd ever mended. Yet so few had noticed. Something shifted that evening. She caught herself humming as she swept the floor, a tune she thought she'd long forgotten. Hope was a dangerous thing. It could lift you high, only to let you fall. And yet against her better judgment, she let it bloom quietly in her chest. Weeks melted into months. Their conversations stretched longer little by little. He spoke of his ranch on the edge of town, of the cattle that needed tending, of the loneliness that hung heavy in wide empty rooms. She spoke sparingly of her past, never of the cruelty or the trade that had brought her here, but of her mother's garden, of the herbs she once grew, of the songs she used to hum by lamplight. The more they shared, the more a fragile bond took root. Not romance, at least not yet, but recognition. The quiet knowledge that neither of them had been truly seen in a long, long while. One evening, as a storm rolled across the plains, James arrived drenched in rain. His hat dripped, his coat heavy with water. Martha, against every caution drilled into her bones, ushered him inside. "Sit by the fire," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and longing. "I'll bring you something warm." As she ladled stew into a bowl and placed it before him, he gave her a look she could not name. Not pity, not hunger. Something steadier. Something that said, "I see you, all of you." He ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and said simply, "Thank you, Martha." 2 words, ordinary words. But to her they were a hymn, a balm, a promise. That night after he left, she sat by the window long after the fire burned down. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the thrum of her heart. It frightened her. It thrilled her. Could it be after years of being unseen, unloved, traded like cattle, could she still be chosen? She had lived decades believing love was for other women, not for her. But now with every loaf of bread, every stolen word, the impossible began to feel near. What would happen when kindness grew too close to deny? Life in small towns was rarely silent. Every word spoken seemed to echo off the wooden storefronts and dirt roads carried by wind and widened by rumor. For Martha, the whispers began the moment James started visiting more often. At first they called it harmless, the cowboy with dust in his boots and hunger in his belly. But as weeks passed and his visits grew longer, the talk sharpened like thorns pressing into tender skin. Imagine that a woman muttered at the market, her voice pitched high enough for Martha to hear. Him of all men keeping company with her. Fat and 50, another chuckled. He must be desperate. The words were daggers wrapped in laughter. And though Martha tried to stand tall, each jab carved deeper into the parts of her that had never healed. One evening when James came by with his usual quiet knock, she hesitated before opening the door. Her hands trembled on the latch. When she finally let him in, her smile was brittle. "You shouldn't come so often," she blurted, eyes fixed on the floor. James studied her for a long moment. "Did I do something wrong?" The word fell heavy like a stone dropped into water. "It's just, people are talking." "Let them," he said simply. She shook her head, voice breaking. "You don't understand. They'll laugh at you. And at me. I've lived with that laughter my whole life. I can't bear it again." His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Martha, I don't give 2 cents for gossip. Bread feeds a man. Kindness keeps him alive. And you've given me both." Her chest ached at his words, but fear clung like a second skin. The struggle was not only outside, it churned inside James too. Alone at night, he wondered what he was doing, lingering at her door week after week. A rancher's life was meant for strength, for certainty. Yet here he was, drawn back again and again, not by need of bread, but by the way her presence softened the rough edges of his days. Still he wrestled with doubt. Could he offer her anything beyond a ranch of quiet rooms and his own scarred heart? Did she even want more than the safety of bread exchanged for coins? The tension reached a breaking point one evening when a group of ranch hands cornered Martha outside the well. "Careful there," one sneered, eyeing the pail she carried. "Don't tip it. Water might be too heavy for a woman her size." The others laughed. Martha's face burned, but she kept her head down. Silence had always been her shield. But then a voice cut through the laughter, steady as a drawn blade. "Enough." The ranch hands turned. James stood a few yards away, his stance broad, his eyes cold as steel. "You got work to do. Do it. Leave her be." The men shifted uneasily, muttering excuses as they slunk off. Martha's heart pounded. She wanted to thank him, but shame sealed her lips. Instead, she hurried home, her thoughts a storm of gratitude and fear. That night she wept quietly by her window, not from the cruelty she was used to that, but from the terrifying warmth of being defended. It had been so long since anyone had stood beside her, but with that warmth came danger, hope, and hope she knew was a fragile thing that often shattered underfoot. A week later, when James came again, she spoke the words she'd been dreading. "You should stop coming here." His brow furrowed. "Why? Because I can't take it," she whispered. "Their laughter, their cruelty, and because I'm afraid. Afraid of what," her eyes filled with tears. "That I'll believe you care, and then one day you'll leave, like everyone else." Silence hung heavy between them. The fire crackled, the wind rattled the shutters. Finally, James spoke, his voice low. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. But leaving you? That's not the kind of man I am." But Martha, scarred by years of rejection, could not let herself believe so easily. The struggle wore on inside and out. Every act of kindness from him tore against the voice in her that hissed she was unworthy. Every cruel whisper from town threatened to undo the fragile threads weaving between them. It was a war between hope and fear, between the heart that longed for love and the wounds that warned against it. And for Martha, the question grew louder each night. Could she dare to believe this was real, or was it just another mirage on a desert road? She had learned to live without hope, but now it pressed at her door, knocking like the cowboy himself. Would she open her heart or let fear lock it away forever? The prairie was never silent. Even when the sun dipped behind the ridges and the cattle settled, sounds carried hooves on dry earth wind through grass. And worst of all, the sharp edge of human voices. For Martha, those voices had always been her undoing. When James began showing up at her door, the town noticed. A rancher with broad shoulders and calloused hands lingering in the company of a woman branded unwanted for decades, it was fuel for gossip. At first they whispered in corners, but soon it slipped into open space, sly comments dressed as humor. Bread must taste better when it comes with extra weight, one merchant quipped, earning chuckles. She's 50 if she's a day, another added. What's he see in her desperation, maybe? Martha pretended not to hear, but each word struck like a stone against glass. And though the glass didn't shatter, cracks spread invisibly inside her. That evening when James came with his usual gentle knock, she froze. Her hands clutched the doorframe, her chest tight. Part of her longed to welcome him in. The other part, the larger, louder part, screamed for her to send him away. She opened the door anyway. But instead of her usual soft smile, she blurted, "You shouldn't come so often." James looked at her, startled. "Did I do something wrong?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "No, it's just people are talking. Let them," he said, simple as a sunrise. "You don't understand." Her voice cracked. "Their laughter follows me home. It's always followed me, and now it'll follow you too." He stepped closer, his shadow filling her doorway. "Martha, bread feeds a man. Kindness keeps him alive. You've given me both. That's worth more than 100 wagging tongues." The words warmed her like fire, but fear was stronger. Fear was a lifelong companion. Later that night, as he walked back to his ranch, James felt the storm inside himself. What was he doing? A cowboy wasn't meant to linger at one woman's table, certainly not one the town scorned. He told himself he came for her bread, for her company. But why did the thought of her tears unsettle him more than a broken fence or a sick horse? Was he in over his head, or was he finally quietly where he belonged? The struggle worsened days later. Martha went to the well for water, the pail heavy against her hip. A group of ranch hands leaned against the rail, laughter already ripe on their tongues. Careful, one drawled. "Don't tip it over. Water might be too heavy for a woman her size." The others cackled. Martha's cheeks burned. She kept her eyes down, her silence a thin shield. She had survived on silence all her life. Then came another voice, low, firm, cutting through the laughter like a whip crack. "Enough." They turned. James stood a few yards away, dust on his boots, fury in his eyes. "You got work to do, then do it. Leave her alone." The ranch hands shuffled, muttered excuses, and slipped away. Martha stood frozen, the pail heavy in her hand, her heart heavier still. Gratitude tangled with terror. Gratitude that someone had defended her. Terror that she would grow used to it, need it, and lose it all when he left, as everyone eventually did. She walked home fast, her throat tight, her eyes brimming. That night she cried by the window, not from the cruelty, she was used to cruelty, but from the unbearable kindness of being seen. The following week, when James knocked again, she didn't answer right away. The latch felt heavier than the pail at the well. When she finally opened, she said the words that hurt her more than any insult ever had. "You should stop coming here." He frowned. "Why? Because I can't take it." Her voice shook. Their laughter. Their cruelty. And she swallowed. "Because I'm afraid. Afraid of what? That I'll believe you care. And then one day you'll leave. Just like the others." Silence filled the room, thick as smoke. The fire crackled. The wind rattled the shutters. Finally he said softly, "I can't promise I'll never fail or falter. But leaving you, that's not who I am." She turned away, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to. But belief felt like stepping onto thin ice after years of drowning. The days blurred after that. He still came. She still baked. But between them stretched a taut wire, humming with everything unsaid. For every act of kindness he offered, the cruel voices of the town rose louder in her mind. For every tender look he gave her, scars shouted louder that she was unworthy. And so she stood at the edge of something she both longed for and feared more than anything, love. She had lived decades without hope. Now hope knocked at her door, wearing the dust and boots of a cowboy. The question was, would she dare open her heart or let fear keep it locked forever? Her silence had always been her shield, But could it also become her prison? When love itself was asking to be let in, could she bear the risk of saying yes? The prairie sky had a way of telling truths. At dawn it blazed with fire, reminding men and women alike that nothing could hold back a new day. At dusk it sank into bruised shades of violet and gold, whispering that endings too carried their own kind of beauty. For Martha, the sky that evening mirrored the turmoil in her chest, storm clouds heavy with rain not yet fallen. It began with a letter. The postwriter had dropped it at her doorstep, folded, neat sealed with no sender. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. Inside only a single line. A man like him will never stay. Don't fool yourself. No signature, no kindness, just cruelty sharpened to a knife's point. She sat at the table staring at it, her breath shallow. For years people had spoken those words with their eyes, with their laughter. Now here they were in ink, undeniable, inescapable. When the knock came that evening, she almost didn't answer. But habit, or maybe hope, made her rise. James stood there holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Brought you some peaches? Neighbor's tree had more than he knew what to do with. His smile was easy warm, but she couldn't hold it. She shoved the letter toward him, her hands shaking. Read it. He frowned, unfolded the page, and his jaw tightened. Who gave you this? Does it matter? Her voice broke. They're right. You'll wake up one morning and realize you wasted your time with me. That I was just convenient. The silence after was worse than shouting. His face was unreadable, his hands clenched tight around the letter. Martha, he said finally, voice low, steady, but carrying a weight that filled the room. Do you think I don't know what they say about you? About me? Her eyes blurred with tears. She turned away. I can't. No. His voice cut sharp like a whip crack. Look at me. She froze. Slowly she lifted her gaze. His eyes, storm, dark, unflinching, held her. I don't come here out of pity. I don't sit at your table for convenience. I come because you're the first woman who ever saw me. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not the broad shoulders or the size of my hands. Just me. And I won't let the smallness of their words take that from me. Or from you. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks. But what if you regret it? He stepped forward close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the dust and leather. He took her hands, work-worn, trembling, and placed them against his chest. His heart thudded strong beneath her palms. Then let me regret it tomorrow. Today I choose you. Something in her broke then, not into pieces but into freedom. For years she had swallowed shame, let it root deep in her bones. But in that moment, with his heartbeat under her fingers, she realized shame had only ever lived where love had been absent. And here now love stood in front of her. She crumpled against him, sobs shaking loose the years of silence. For the first time she let herself be held, not out of duty, not out of arrangement, but out of want. He wrapped his arms around her, steady as the land itself, and whispered, You're not too much. You're not too old. You're not too late. You're enough, Martha. More than enough. The days after were different. The town still talked, whispers sharp as nettles, but she noticed how much softer they sounded when she walked beside him. One afternoon, as they carried supplies back from town, a pair of women smirked openly. Guess some men like heavy burdens, one said loud enough to carry. Martha's chest clenched, but before she could lower her eyes, James stopped in the street. He turned, his voice calm but fierce burden. He looked at Martha, then back at them. She's the strongest woman I know. She's walked through fire and still knows how to be kind. You call that a burden, I call it gold. The women flushed, muttered, and hurried away. For the first time in her life, Martha didn't shrink. She stood tall, her hand still carrying the basket of flour, her chin lifted. And when she looked at James, she saw not just a man who defended her, but a man who believed her worth was beyond question. That night, as the prairie wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. She broke bread. He poured coffee. And between them, silence stretched, not heavy this time, but tender like a blanket shared. Why me? She whispered at last. He set down his cup, thought for a long moment, then said, Because you're the first woman I ever chose. Her breath caught. He nodded slowly. All my life, others tried to choose for me. Who I should marry, what kind of woman fit beside me. But you were never offered to me. Never pushed. Never expected. You just were. And when I saw you, Martha really saw you, I knew. This wasn't about what I was supposed to want. This was about what my soul did want. Her tears came silent this time, but they weren't bitter. They were sweet like spring rain after drought. For the first time in 50 years, she felt chosen not as a compromise, not as a shadow, but as a treasure. The breaking point had come, and she had survived it. Not just survived, been changed by it. The glass that had cracked so long under the weight of cruel voices now glittered with light edges softened by love. Her fear had whispered, "He will leave." But his love had answered louder, "I will stay." And for once she believed it. For half a lifetime, Martha believed her scars made her unworthy. But in the arms of a man who saw her whole, she found that scars weren't proof of weakness. They were proof she had endured. And endurance at last had led her home. The prairie had its own way of teaching patience. Seeds buried in dust might look lifeless for months, but when the rains finally came, when the sun lingered long enough, those seeds would push through fragile and green. So it was with Martha. She woke one morning to the smell of biscuits. Blinking against the soft gray light, she shuffled from her room to find James in the kitchen, flour dusting his hands, his hair tousled. "Thought I'd try my hand at baking," he said with a sheepish grin. The biscuits were uneven, some too flat, others nearly burnt. But the sight of this man, a rancher whose hands had known ropes and branding irons more than dough fumbling for her sake, it filled her chest with warmth. "You've ruined the pan," she teased gently, but her smile gave her away. He laughed, the sound rich, unguarded. "Then I'll ruin 100 more if it means seeing you smile like that." Her heart trembled, not with fear this time, but with something she hadn't felt in decades, a beginning. Life didn't transform overnight. There were still whispers when they went into town, still stares that clung too long. But Martha found she carried them differently now. Their weight was lighter, softened by the memory of his voice saying, "You're gold." At the mercantile, when the clerk raised an eyebrow at the sight of her and James together, Martha stood a little straighter. When James reached for her hand openly as they walked past the blacksmith's, she didn't pull away. For the first time, she stopped apologizing for existing. The ranch itself became a canvas for change. James cleared out a small plot near the house, handed her a basket of seeds. "Figure you might like a garden." Her breath caught. She hadn't tended a garden since she was a girl, back before life had hardened around her. Kneeling in the soil, she let the dirt cling to her palms, the scent of earth rising. She planted rows of bean squash wildflowers. Each seed felt like a small promise that something could take root here, something that belonged to her. And when the first shoots appeared weeks later, pushing shyly through the ground, she cried. Not because they were fragile, but because they were real. One evening as the sun sank, Martha sat on the porch, her sewing in her lap. James came up behind her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, staring at the horizon. He frowned. "Regret what? Choosing me?" His hand squeezed. "Martha, I've worked cattle in blizzards, dug fence posts in ground, hard as stone, gone days without food. Hard work doesn't scare me, but I'll tell you the truth. The hardest, best work I've ever done is learning how to love you the way you deserve. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Her throat tightened. She lowered her sewing, turned to him. The fading sunlight framed him in gold, as if the land itself was blessing his words. For the first time, she didn't question. She let herself believe. But hope is fragile when it's new. And as much as Martha wanted to settle fully into peace, the world tested her still. One Sunday at church, as she walked in beside James, a woman leaned over to whisper, not quietly enough, "Strange, isn't it? A man like him with her." The words pierced like old thorns. Martha froze. But James stopped too. He turned his broad shoulders toward the pews, his voice steady but caring. "You're right," he said, making the congregation fall silent. "It is strange. Strange that it took me 50 years to find the one woman who's more honest, more steady, and more beautiful than any I've known. And stranger still that anyone would waste their breath questioning a gift like that." The hush that followed was sharp. Then slowly Martha lifted her chin, and for the first time in that church, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Her tears that morning weren't shame. They were relief. The days stretched into weeks. The garden grew. The biscuits got a little better. The house, once too quiet, now pulsed with life, laughter, by the fire, conversation over supper, the steady rhythm of two people choosing each other daily. For the first time, Martha didn't just exist, she lived. One evening, under a sky spilling with stars, James leaned close, his voice a low murmur. "You ever think about what's next?" She smiled faintly. "At my age, I try not to think too far ahead." He shook his head gently. "That's the thing, Martha. With you, I want ahead. I want all the mornings, all the evenings, however many were given." Her breath caught her chest, swelling with something deeper than joy, something like peace. She placed her hand over his. "Then we'll take them, James. One sunrise at a time." The prairie had taught her patience. The garden had taught her faith. But James had taught her something greater, that even after half a lifetime of being unwanted, love could still arrive not as a storm, but as a steady dawn. And in that light, hope bloomed. For years, Martha thought her story was finished. But in the gentle constancy of one man's love, she discovered it was only beginning. And perhaps that is the gift of late love. It doesn't rush. It roots deep. It stays. The prairie had always been a land of testing. Too much rain and the rivers swallowed crops. Too little and the earth cracked like old leather. And sometimes the test came in the form of fire. It began with smoke on the horizon. Martha was kneeling in her garden, fingers brushing the tender leaves of her beans, when the wind shifted. A sharp, acrid smell stung her nose. She looked up to see a line of gray curling against the sky. Her heart lurched. Out here, smoke meant one thing. "James," she called, voice trembling. He came running, eyes narrowing as he saw the haze thickening in the west. The prairie grass was dry that summer, brittle as tinder. All it would take was a spark lightning or a careless traveler, and miles could burn in hours. Without hesitation, James grabbed buckets, wet sacks, his face grim. "We'll fight it if it comes near." Martha's hands shook, but she followed. She knew this land, knew its cruelties, yet she also knew she could not stand idle. By afternoon, the fire was visible, a red glow crawling closer, whipped by wind. The cattle bawled nervously in their pens, horses pacing. Martha's chest tightened at the sight of flames, leaping like wild animals across the grass. Memories clawed up from her, past the nights of helplessness, when men decided her worth, when life had reduced her to silence. She had spent so many years feeling powerless. And here it was again, a force larger than her, threatening to consume what little she had built. But then she looked at James. Steady, determined, no fear in his stride, as he hauled water, dug a shallow trench. He turned to her, sweat streaking his face. "I can't do this alone, Martha." And something in her broke free. Together they worked side by side. She dragged heavy sacks, soaked them, slapped them down to smother sparks. He hauled buckets, doused fence posts. The air grew thick, smoke clawing at their lungs, heat pressing in. At one point, a gust sent flames racing toward the house. Martha froze, terror stabbing her chest. But James's voice cut through. "Martha, with me." She ran, skirts dragging, and together they beat back the edge of the fire, coughing, choking, but refusing to let it win. Hours blurred, arms ached, hands blistered. Still they fought, stubborn as the earth itself. And when at last the wind shifted, pushing the fire away, Martha collapsed to her knees, tears streaking her soot-blackened cheeks. James dropped beside her, pulling her close despite the grime. His voice was hoarse but fierce. "You see, you're stronger than you ever knew." That night the land smoldered, black scars stretching where grass had been. But the house still stood. The garden, though singed, had survived. And so had they. Inside, by lantern light, James cleaned Martha's burned palms, wrapping them gently. His touch was careful, reverent. She watched him, her heart breaking open. "Why do you care for me like this?" she whispered. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Because you're the first woman I ever chose. Not out of duty, not out of desperation, but because when I see you, I see the life I've been searching for." Her breath caught. The words felt like cool water on the raw places inside her. All her life she had been bargained over, weighed, judged, never chosen, until now. She pressed her bandaged hand over his. "Then let me choose you too, James. Not because I need saving, but because with you I can finally be myself." The silence that followed was tender, full. Outside, the prairie still smoldered, but inside something had caught fire too, a flame that would not destroy but warm. In the days that followed, neighbors came by to see the damage, to murmur their shock at how close the fire had come. Martha noticed something new in their eyes: respect, admiration. She was no longer just the fat woman James had taken in. She was the woman who had stood in the flames and fought. For the first time, she felt not just seen, but honored. One evening, as the land cooled and stars returned, James took her hand on the porch. "You know," he said softly, "when I saw that fire, I thought I might lose everything. But then I realized everything isn't this land or the cattle or even this house. It's you." Her eyes filled. For years, she had believed she was nothing more than a burden. Yet here in his words, she was treasure. Martha leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice a whisper. "Then let's not waste another day." And in that moment, hope was no longer fragile. It was fierce. The fire tested them, but in the smoke and the struggle, Martha discovered not just her strength, but the truth of a love that had chosen her fully, freely, and forever. The weeks after the fire brought a strange quiet to the prairie. Ash still dusted the wind. The air smelled faintly of smoke, even after the rains came. But where the fire had scorched, tiny shoots of green now poked through, stubborn and bright. It was as though the land itself whispered, "I am not finished. I will live again." And Martha felt the same inside her chest. For days her body ached from the fight, hands wrapped in linen, muscles sore. Yet every morning she rose to meet the dawn beside James. She watered what little had survived in the garden, tied up new seedlings, cooked meals, and mended burned cloth. But this time none of it felt like labor done in silence or shame. Every act was shared. James was there, hammering new fence posts, brushing soot from the barn, laughing when the wind tried to steal his hat. And often when he caught her watching, he'd smile in that quiet way of his, as though he knew that survival meant more than breath. It meant belonging. One evening, the neighbors gathered for a barn raising to replace what had burned. Men carried heavy beams. Women laid out food. Children chased each other through the dust. Martha felt a strange trembling as she set a pot of stew on the table. For years, gatherings had been a place of pain, whispers behind her back, cruel laughter at her size, the sting of knowing she was less than. But this time, when the women looked at her, their eyes held respect. One of them, Mrs. Hargrove, touched her arm and said softly, "You fought like a lion out there. Folks are talking not about your size, but your courage. We're glad you're one of us." Martha blinked hard, swallowing tears. For the first time, she felt not just tolerated, but accepted. As twilight deepened, James stood before the gathered crowd. He wasn't a man of speeches, but he cleared his throat, voice steady. "This land nearly burned us out," he said, "but fire only shows what can't be destroyed. And what can't be destroyed is the spirit of those who stand together." Then he turned eyes on Martha, and something in his gaze silenced even the restless children. "I fought that fire with my own hands, but I would have been lost without her. Martha stood with me, and she's the reason this place is still standing. I want everyone here to know," his voice caught rough, "with feeling she's not just my partner in work. She's my partner in life. From now on, she carries my name and my whole heart." A hush fell. Then a cheer broke out, voices ringing against the night. Martha's breath trembled, but James reached for her hand, lifting it high like a vow. She felt seen not as a burden, but as a woman chosen openly, proudly before all. Later, when the crowd had gone and the stars hung bright, James and Martha sat on the porch, the prairie stretching quiet around them. "Do you believe it?" he asked gently. "That after all you've endured, you were meant for this?" Martha looked out across the fields, blackened, yes, but already dotted with new life. "I think," she said slowly, "that everything broken in me brought me here, and here I am, whole." James took her hand, threading his fingers with hers. His grip was warm, certain. "You don't have to hide your scars, Martha. Not from me, not from anyone." And for the first time in 50 years, she believed it. That night, she dreamt not of loss or ridicule, but of a wide river flowing steady and strong. In the dream, she and James walked beside it, the current carrying away what was heavy, leaving only lightness behind. When she woke, the dawn was breaking, pale gold spilling over the land. She smiled, knowing the dream was true. Her life had not ended with rejection, nor with years of being dismissed. It had begun again here in the quiet strength of a man who had chosen her, and in the courage she had finally claimed for herself. And so the prairie healed slowly, surely, and so did Martha. Where once she had been sold, now she was treasured. Where once she had been silenced, now she was seen. Where once she had been unloved, now she was chosen. Not for what she could give, not for what she looked like, but for who she was, and that she knew was the greatest miracle of all. Martha's story reminds us that healing doesn't erase the scars, it transforms them into proof of survival. And love, when it comes, doesn't fix us. It simply lets us be seen as we already are. In the end, her story wasn't only about pain, it was about resilience. She had been rejected, mocked, and even sold as if she had no worth. But then came a man who looked at her with quiet certainty and said, "You're the first woman I ever chose." Those words didn't just change her life. They remind us of something deeply human. No matter how much we've endured, no matter the scars we carry, we are still worthy of love, dignity, and belonging. Sometimes love doesn't arrive early or easily, it arrives later when we've learned to value ourselves enough to recognize it. And maybe that's what the Wild West teaches us too. Beneath the dust and hardship, there is always a seed of hope waiting to bloom even when we think the soil is barren. So perhaps this story isn't only hers, it's ours. It's a reminder to treat each other with kindness, to look for the gold in others when the world only sees dust. If this touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to None. Wild West Saga. Share this story with someone who might need its comfort and leave a comment below. Tell me, would you like to see more stories like this of late blooming love, of second chances, of courage found in unexpected places? Or perhaps would you want to know what happened next in their journey? Your voice matters here.